Hey guys, I'm Chris.
And I'm Mike.
And this is No Limits, a Mitch Rapp podcast. Today we're going to introduce you to some of our inspirations, why we wanted to do this podcast. We're going to talk about Mitch Rapp, as well as the two men who deserve all the credit, Vince Flynn and Kyle Mills.
And I just wanted to put in a future spoiler alert. Most of our future episodes will be book reviews. We're going to break down each book into a 3-part series. And in between, we'll be releasing bonus episodes covering other content in the Mitch Rapp universe. Those may contain spoilers as we discuss the series as a whole. And so if you're a new reader, be sure to skip the bonus episodes and come back to them later. Once you have more of the Mitch Rapp saga under your belt, they may have some spoiler information. For this episode, we're going to keep it mostly general, not reveal too many specific spoilers about the storylines and the character arcs over the entire course of the 18 books.
I think it's interesting that Mike actually approached me about doing this podcast because of the situation that's going on, and we actually reconnected our friend group from college, and we started talking about the latest Vince Flynn book and the latest Brad Thor books, and then Mike went and read the latest book,
Lethal Agent,
and not to spoil it, but the plot has
it's relevant,
very relevant to
it's quite relevant
time. And then we just got started talking on like one of these Zoom calls we were having about who's read this one, who's read that one, and it re-sparked my interest in the story as well as Mike's.
Yeah, I remember after that Zoom call, and since college, we were buddies back in college, there had been long periods, 6 months, maybe sometimes almost a year, where we maybe haven't heard from each other. And since we started these Zoom calls and talking about Vince Flynn, we've been in contact just about every day. So I like that. I like how podcasts bringing people together.
Yeah, it's been nice to not only talk about Mitch Rapp and Vince Flynn novels with you, but also just to reconnect with you and some of my other friends, Tom, and it's interesting. Tom Smith is the one who, or I shouldn't say his name. Tom.
Yeah, how'd you get into these stories? Like, what was the first memory you have of Mitch Rapp entering your life?
Well, so we were living in DC, and I just finished reading The Hunger Games, and I wanted another series to read. So I remember asking around roommates, and both Tom and other Tom were like, oh, you should read these books by Vince Flynn or these books by Brad Thor. I was like, sure, I'll give it a go. And then the next day, I think Tom went home that weekend, and then on Monday he came back with this giant shopping, paper shopping bag full of the first, all the Vince Flynn novels that he had purchased in paperback, and we're like, start with this one.
He filled the Honda Pilot with all the Vince Flynn books. Red Honda Pilot.
Yeah. He says, start with this one. And
I think, do you remember which one it was?
So he gave me both the Brad Thor novels and the Vince Flynn novels, and he told me to start with Lions of Lucerne, which
that's a good one.
The first in the Scott Harvath series.
That's a good one.
I started reading those, and I didn't get too far, but I really liked them. But I didn't get too far, and then I had to give them back when we moved out. And then I really took a pause on reading for a long time until 5 years later, when I started my PhD up here in New York. I had a lot of time on my hands, so I wanted to get into reading, and I had remembered that I liked these novels, and so I got a library card, and I just started plowing through. I would go back and forth between, either Brad Thor or Vince Flynn, depending on which ones I could get digitally from the library through like their loan system, and so I consumed both entire series in about a year.
Yeah, the library systems, they've been pretty generous with this genre, the whole spy political thriller. I feel like a lot of the Vince Flynn books I found there, and actually the next one we're reading, I'm probably going to do an audiobook through the library. So we'll see how that goes. I think my beginnings go back a little earlier. And this is a strange memory, and I don't know why it's so vivid. And if you know me at all, I'm pretty forgetful, as any listeners are going to pick up on pretty soon. But for some reason, this one is vivid. I don't know why. Maybe because I just like the book so much, but it was Memorial Day.
Great book.
The book. I don't know if the day was Memorial Day. Probably wasn't. But the book, I saw it in Barnes and Noble, and my family had this routine, and it was one of the many idiosyncrasies of my father. He would follow around my mom and I at Barnes and Noble, continually badgering us. Are you done yet? Ready to check out? He was over our shoulder every minute. And anything you picked off the shelf, even if you're just reading The Dust Jacket, he was right there saying, we're getting it, taking it out of your hands. And he just wanted to give us the world. Well, I remember Memorial Day had just come out. It was sitting there as one of those front and center, highlight best new fiction. And 2004, Memorial Day was published. So what was I, only 14 or 15 at the time? So just as a teenager, I saw this book. I thought the cover was cool. Being honest, it had this CIA seal and it had this nice light blue. And maybe what got me at the time was the Dan Brown quote on the cover.
Nice.
I'm guessing 2004, being a teenager, I was probably coming off a Dan Brown kick. Have you read those?
Yes, those are also. I consumed a lot of books in my first year of my PhD here, and
I believe it.
Consumed all of the Dan Brown novels along with these. So
I'm thinking that must have been. I think just the cool shiny cover, and it must have been this Dan Brown quote because I think Da Vinci Code had just come out.
Yeah, that would have been around the same time. I think
around the same time. I think a few years before. I remember after Da Vinci Code, I immediately picked up the other ones, his older ones, Deception Point, and a couple others. And so I think seeing his name on the cover really hooked me in. But I picked it up, and before I could even read it, my dad yanks it out of my hand, says, "We're getting it." So I picked it up. I was hooked. I remember reading it probably in a day or two. I was just all about it at the time. And I went right ahead and picked up all the other ones beforehand, and probably through high school finished all the ones that were currently out at the time.
Wow. Yeah, I wish that I had read these earlier. They're really good. I enjoy them. My father-in-law is really big into this kind of stuff, and so it's something that we've been able to connect with and talk about. Although he doesn't quite remember, he's read them a long time ago, and so he can't. It's kind of sometimes the storylines bleed together, so we can't always. I've just read it, so I know all the minutia details, and he's like, "Oh, does this happen in that one, or does that happen in that one?" But yeah, it's been a nice connecting point. And I know a lot of people that are our age and that have read these.
Yeah. I think there's something about them, depending on your demographics and maybe your political affiliations. But I think there's something gripping about these, and that speaks to a little later on when we get to Vince Flynn and in his own words, what he believes is the compelling features of these books or what draws in such a wide audience base. So if you, the listeners, have any origin stories, how you got into Mitch Rapp, if you remember anything about your first Vince Flynn novel, let us know. At the end of the episode, we'll be giving you our email address and our Twitter account. And we'd love to hear, how'd you get into the series?
Yeah, that'd be really great if we could hear from you guys. Always interested to see how people get into any series. So,
all right. Well, you want to hear something really bad? I thought, we're doing a podcast on Mitch Rapp. Where do we have to get our baseline information from but Wikipedia?
Yeah, you go to Wikipedia. Always.
Like I'm a teacher, so like any 11 or 12-year-old in my class, I ask them to do something, they go right there. So
I'm a researcher, and that's the first thing I do is go to Wikipedia. What is COVID-19?
Oh, gosh. And you do work in biology, right?
I know.
Okay.
It's gotten a lot better. I think back in the day, teachers like you would be like, you can't use Wikipedia as a source. And I still don't think that's possible, but it's gotten better.
Hey, so tell me what you think. This is the first description that comes up for who I'm going to say is a much more dynamic, much more extreme character than what we're given, but you tell me. According to Wikipedia, Rapp is a counterterrorism operative employed, first unofficially, then officially by the CIA. The primary focus of the character is thwarting foreign terrorist attacks on the United States, and he is presented as an aggressive operative who is willing to take measures that are more extreme than might be considered commonly acceptable.
Wow.
Does that sanitize Mitch Rapp at all, or is that just me?
Yeah, it's very sanitized portrayal of Mitch Rapp. He's such a complex character, and
Yeah.
he's
I think that's
evolved so much over the years that doesn't do him any justice. But that's
I think that's
Wikipedia for you.
I think that's the draw. You know, you could read one Mitch Rapp novel, or heck, even a chapter of him just doing something completely off the wall, and you could love it. But then if you are a real fan and you stick it out, that arc he goes through over the whole course of the series, but even at the climax of his life and the devastating things he goes through, I think seeing Rapp over a long period of time, and particularly American Assassin, giving us his origin story as a younger man, I think once you look at the character as a whole, he is just extraordinarily complete in the way that Vince Flynn covers and explores his life. It almost becomes like a psychodrama, you know, a psychoanalysis of what he's doing. And you wouldn't necessarily get that full picture from just one book. You might just think, oh, he's just some extreme guy willing to do whatever it takes. But the way that plays out in all the different scenarios over the course of these books is absolutely beyond what your first impression might be.
Right. I think that it's interesting to take Mitch as a character and to take, you know, a couple of the other key characters like Irene Kennedy or Thomas Stansfield or Scott Coleman or Stan Hurley, and to look at them across, you know, the entire series. It's really interesting to see how both Kyle and Vince have developed them. But yeah, you're right. If you were to just pick up one book, and these books are generally written pretty well that you can pick up at any point.
Yes.
And read it. You might not pick up on the little minutia details that they'll put in for people like us who are reading the whole story, but in general, you know, you can pick up any book and read it, and it's succinct. I think like a lot of authors in this sort of genre try to do that.
Yeah. Now, at the same time, I think Vince Flynn was really motivated by a very simple, and this does come through in the writing and the characters, a very simple, almost black and white view of, I'll say America, but I guess you could expand that to even just morality in the sense of right and wrong. I mean, here's a quote from Vince Flynn during an interview, and I think it sums up not just his personal philosophy going into these books, but you'll see how expertly that philosophy has infused everything Mitch Rapp does and sees in the world. And so Flynn said, "The key to these books is that the villains are terrorists and the secondary villains are politicians. The other secret to it is that the good guys are the military, CIA, and law enforcement. Most people in America get that." Do you think he's right? And that's the draw of these books and a character like Rapp? Is it just that most people in America get there's good and there's bad?
Yeah, I think so. What's interesting to me about Mitch Rapp and this idea of black or white is Mitch almost seems to be, I've never been able to fully guess what Mitch's political affiliation is. He just knows that this is wrong and and that's what I want to do. You know, it's apolitical, this kind of stuff that he tries to do. And a lot of times that's what gets either him in trouble or is a driving force with someone like like you said, the secondary villains, the politicians, because, you know, oftentimes in society, politics come into things where politics don't need to be. You know, it's like, this is wrong. This needs to be, you know, avenged for or taken care of. And I find that interesting about how they've written it, how, you know, some of the things that Mitch, I think, supports or you could take as his political background is like, he could lean either way at some of the points. I mean, I think, you know, Vince obviously is a Republican, or, you know, conservative leading. And he does characterize himself as a conservative, but with some.
I think that's spot on though, because with Mitch Rapp, the actual political spectrum doesn't matter so much as this right or wrong that can be superimposed on the political spectrum wherever you are. But if the political spectrum is holding you back, preventing you or preventing the country from doing something that is considered right or something that would eliminate evil, I feel like that breaks the categories of politics. That Vince Flynn's political positions on things become secondary to Mitch Rapp's desire for justice, Mitch Rapp's desire for eradicating evil. And it's almost like it doesn't matter where something may fall on the political spectrum. We can obviously interpret it a certain way, but to him, it's more about right and wrong every time. And I think that quote, the good guys are the military, the CIA and law enforcement, very clearly shows both Flynn and Rapp's ideologies here.
Yeah, I would agree.
So while we're talking about Vince Flynn, I thought we would look at who he was, his background, and see if that helps us figure out the inspiration he had in writing these books. And it's a pretty interesting story. Vince was born in 1966 in St. Paul, Minnesota. And I didn't know this, and there's no way I would have picked up on it, but it turns out he had dyslexia and struggled through most of his childhood and even his adult life with reading and writing. He eventually accepted an aviation slot with the Marine Corps, but was medically discharged for prior medical history involving concussions and convulsive seizures. And it was only at that point that he began thinking seriously about writing his own book. He took a gamble, quit his current job, and moved to Colorado. And it was there that he started writing what would eventually come together as Term Limits, his first novel. He couldn't get traction early on. So in 1997, he decided to self-publish, going around to various bookstores trying to sell copies. Shortly after that, what became self-published as Term Limits would be picked up. It would become the #1 best-selling book in the Twin Cities, and he'd land a 2-book deal with Pocket Books and Simon Schuster. So pretty lucky he did that and overcame the adversity. First, struggling with dyslexia through his childhood, and then also struggling with the discharge from the Marine Corps. And I think that 2-book deal, his next one, is where we get Mitch Rapp.
Yeah, that's a big deal. It's a pretty cool story about this guy, with dyslexia, and that obviously probably affects his writing, and like how hard that must have been. Like that's reading that and thinking about how successful he's come, and having to like self-publish and go from bookstore to bookstore and get them to sell these himself. Like that's a pretty cool story. It really gives hope to a lot of aspiring authors, I guess.
But as a middle school teacher, I definitely have had students struggling through dyslexia, and it's not just and any other sort of challenges, but it's not just the academic consequences of that, it's the social stigma that comes with it. And so to see Vince thrive, really become what I would consider one of the greatest pop fiction or modern day pop entertainment kind of genre, become one of the finest at that craft, is pretty inspiring.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Now he wouldn't, as you most likely know, he wouldn't get to finish the entire series and tell us the how Mitch Rapp's life and story wraps up. He did pass away at the young age of 47 in 2013 after a long-time battle with prostate cancer. Thankfully, though, his memory is so clearly preserved in these characters and these books. He's left quite a legacy.
Definitely. I thought it was interesting that he came up with the name Mitch Rapp from a colleague, a friend in college, right? And he didn't have the same name. I think he had the same last name, and he wanted to make a monosyllabic first name. So that's how he started with Mitch, and then took the last name Rapp.
That's right. It does roll off pretty nice, Mitch Rapp.
It's a very, very nice thing.
Yeah, he would end up, though, over the course of these books, sell 15 million copies just during his lifetime, and I'm sure plenty millions more after that since 2013. And a lot of them have been translated into several different languages across the world. So pretty successful.
Yeah. I found my note on what he says. He says he would say that he's a fiscally conservative and socially liberal. So I like that. I like that.
Yeah, I think, again, while a lot of that does come through in the writing, it's almost Mitch Rapp's right and wrong supersedes any sort of political categories to what the situation is and making a call, right or wrong, black and white, in the moment, and acting on it regardless of different ways to categorize situations.
Yeah. Mitch is very neutral and has a very, there's no gray with Mitch.
There's no gray. There's no blurred lines.
Yeah, and then doing some research on Kyle Mills, I found it really interesting. I wanted to, while we were doing this, doing research for this episode, I didn't really know why. I knew that Vince had died of prostate cancer and that Kyle Mills had picked up for him, but really wanted to dive into like see if I could find out why how he got picked or who he was, because I've never read any other Kyle Mills of his other works. But before picking up Mitch Rapp and the Vince Flynn storyline, he had published a couple different things. Most notably, he had an FBI agent series based off of the character Mark Beeman. And so he grew up as an FBI kid. His dad was in the FBI. His dad was also in charge of Interpol. And so he moved around traveling a lot. And so he drew from his knowledge of being in that environment. I'm sure he has a lot of connections from that, being in that environment, having his dad being so high up in a law enforcement agency, as well as connections with the FBI. It probably lends you to talk intelligently about the subject matter. It's interesting that his career almost kind of parallels Vince's. They both published their first books in 1997, as well as like he got positive feedback from a lot of thriller fans. And on his website, he stated that he was very fascinated with the dark side of politics, as well as how that was connected to the intelligence community. I guess Vince obviously is doing the same thing. And I saw another interesting tidbit that overlap between the two is that, overlap between him and Mitch, the character, is that, one of the things that drives Mitch is the downing of the Pan Am Lockerbie flight in Scotland. And spoiler alert, jump ahead 15 seconds if you don't want to know this.
We won't give away everything, not all the details. That is a key moment we learn in Mitch's life.
Yeah, he loses his, at the time, college sweetheart at Syracuse University in that flight. And that really is a defining action in his life. And so apparently his dad was the lead agent on that terrorist attack. Like they were
is Kyle Mills.
Yeah, Kyle
his
Mills.
Father. Wow.
His father. They were stationed in London, and so he remembers his dad getting the call, and they were like at a restaurant eating dinner for his college graduation actually, and he said that was the last time I saw my dad for a couple months.
Wow.
So I thought that was kind of a cool overlap between like the character Mitch and the author.
It kind of is like, was Kyle Mills destined to pick up this character that Vince Flynn had been writing this character who that terrorist attack was such a seminal part of his life. And years later, it's more than almost 2 decades later than the Pan Am attacks in the late 80s, that in 2013, Kyle Mills would get to pick up the story of a similar character impacted by that event. Jeez, that's wild.
That is wild. Yeah, and it's interesting. He had lived in Maryland. He had moved to Wyoming, where he still currently lives. He really likes rock climbing. Never really did anything creative with anything until his wife told him that, you should do something like this. And that's what led him to write his first book, which is Rising Phoenix. And that's what I mentioned, is that series that follows that Mark Beeman, the FBI agent.
With the FBI.
I'm actually really intrigued to maybe read. There's 5 books in that series. Might want to dive into that.
Him getting that spark to do something creative. It's kind of like us and this podcast during the quarantine.
Yeah, and then he's also been tabbed to write for a Ludlum series that is not based on Jason Bourne, but was a series that followed a little bit more scientific genre, in still like thriller military aspects. But so he wrote 3 books in that. And then I listened to an interview with this guy called Alan Peterson, he has a Meet the Thriller podcast, and he interviews a bunch of thriller authors. And yes, Kyle Mills mentions that he got a call from the Finn family, and that they were like, do you want to pick this up? Obviously I'm sure people who have read his stuff have read Vince's stuff, and so they knew what he was capable of.
They knew what they were getting.
Right. And what I thought that was really cool is that he was like, Vince had 3 pages written for for the
That's the
Survivor.
Survivor. Yeah, that's the
For
book
the
during the
Survivor.
transition.
Yeah, and so he said that he was fascinated by this because he lays out that he is the way he writes books is he writes almost like a 40,000 word outline, which is a huge outline, right? So essentially the whole book is written by the time the outline's done, and then it's just all about fleshing it out. And he just assumed that most authors are like that, you know. He finds out, he's like, okay, I'll write these books. Let me get Vince's materials. Let me.
Yeah.
And then he's like, all right, well, they have a box of stuff at his office, you know, you can go get it. And they found out he had like 3 pages, not even a full 3 pages, 2.5 pages of the Survivor written. And apparently the way Vince wrote was nothing the way Kyle writes. He sat down and he wrote. And so what was interesting is that transition, right, to Survivor from The Last Man. A lot of times in the series, there'll be continuations where the one book after the other will have a lot of major plot points that will continue on, right? And that just happened to be one of these continuations, like these 2 chapters. And so because of that element, he wanted to stay as close to what what Vince had established in The Last Man. And so he wanted to make it as seamless as possible. And then once he finished that, he could really grow and evolve the character and move on to some different things. And I think we've seen that with the last couple of novels. Kyle Mills sort of adding his spin on it. I remember reading one of the, they had the quotes on the back, or like interviews with an author in one of the novels. He talks about how he thinks adds a little more humor in his writing. And I would tend to agree to that. I think that Mitch gets a little bit more funnier in these last couple novels than what Vince had added in the the beginning novels. But yeah,
he's also probably just getting a little bit more dejected or more cynical towards the later stages of his career as well.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So
definitely
the almost sarcastic humor might come through. Yeah, I was gonna say I don't know if I necessarily picked up on that. And like I said, I started reading these as a teenager, so keep on me as we do these book reviews to come back to that. I'm really curious to see if I also noticed that shift.
It'll be interesting to as we're going along to see if we can pick up that. And he mentioned that he wrote the first chapter to the Survivor, and he put in the 3 pages that Vince had written.
I was wondering, do you know if he kept to 100% those words and those pages, or at least tried to keep the tone of them?
I think that's what he did, and he tried to have. Can you pick out? Like he told people, 3 of these pages are written by Vince.
Wow.
Can you pick them out? And he really studied his word structure. And that's what I'm saying. Like the first book, The Survivor, he tried to be, almost like replicate, because he said like his writing style was very different than what Vince had done. And so that first novel, he wanted to make it as seamless as possible, sort of hook the readers, be like, hey, I'm going to take this over. I can do, just as good a job.
Yep.
I'm going to honor this character. And then after that, you can sort of, do whatever. But I think I'm going to, we'll get there in time, but I think that the quality hasn't gone down.
No, not at all.
I enjoy Kyle Mills, just as
I think
much
we have to remember to do that. When we get to the Survivor, we've got to see if we can pick out those 3 pages or if we can notice it. I think cool. Kyle Mills has done a fantastic job. Obviously, I think we'd all agree the right person for the job. Even in his own words, his goal with the Survivor is to, quote, stick very closely to Vince's style and try to capture Mitch exactly as he did. And with such a different personal writing style, I think we can largely say Mills was successful in doing that.
I would definitely agree.
Yeah, so that's an overview of the main characters in our journey on this podcast. Mitch Rapp, of course, but also the 2 authors we will be leaning heavily on for inspiration, Vince Flynn and Kyle Mills. We'd love to hear your origin stories. How did you get into the series? What stories do you have being a fan, being a rap head? And so if you want to reach out to us, please email us at mitchrappod@gmail.com and tweet us using the Twitter handle @mitchrappod. And remember, our next few episodes are going to be a book review of Term Limits, Vince Flynn's first novel, his only novel before the creation of Mitch Rapp, though Term Limits does introduce a number of key characters who are going to be with us throughout the entire series. Our next episode, part 1 of Term Limits, will be chapters 1 through the end of chapter 14. Part 2, which will come out shortly after that, we will read chapters 15 through the end of chapter 29. And our third part in the series will finish the book reviewing chapter 30 all the way to the end.
And as always, just let Mitch be Mitch. Disclaimer, guys, we are just simply two fans offering a discussion and reviews of some of our favorite books and characters. This podcast is not officially affiliated with Vince Flynn, Kyle Mills, or Simon & Schuster. But thank you to them for bringing us this wonderful world of Mitch Rapp.